But before all that, Parliament was recalled today to debate a motion calling for a new war in the Middle East. But you wouldn't know if you've been listening to BBC's supposed 24-hour news radio on 5 Live. They've been carrying wall-to-wall the thrilling Ryder Cup golf tournament. This time it looks like no boots on the ground, just British bombs going to fall on the bad guys and the inevitable civilians. But we ask, what they won't. Is ISIS a creation of the West? Are some of our so-called allies actively aiding these terrorists? And could we stop ISIS overnight if we really wanted? Plus, Martin will take us on his weekly tour of the world's hotspots. Now, Martin, this week I thought we'd go through some of the stuff to do with ISIS, some of which is and some of which isn't being discussed in the Commons today. First of all, the objective seems to be Syria. Is that as simple as that?
Well, in the sense that ultimately, I would see that we were trying to they tried to bamboozle us into a war with Syria at this time last year. That didn't work because of basically the resistance of the ordinary people in Britain and in the US who told their politicians we didn't want to do that. So they've now found another way for us to intervene by attacking the people that we would have been supporting this time last year if we had bombed the Syrian Arab army.
Now, I'm looking at some of the evidence of complicity. First of all, we have seen this week footage on Press TV, the Iranian channel, of ISIS freely operating in the Golan Heights. Now, the Golan Heights is disputed territory. It's actually part of Syria in international law, but it's completely controlled by the Israelis. So why would the Israelis be allowing ISIS to operate there freely?
Well, as I understand it, it wasn't necessarily ISIS, it was al-Nusra Front is what I saw, but nevertheless the Israelis are definitely allowing jihadis to enter Israel for rest and recreation and also for medical support. And of course the Israelis occasionally lob in a missile or an artillery shell to support the rebels against the Syrian army.
Some of our friends' complicity. Another point is that many of these people have been trained in Jordan. They're our allies.
Well, indeed, and I think there was quite strong evidence that US and British special forces were training these people, and also on the Turkish border as well, which is what makes this whole thing ridiculous. This time last year, we were being told that we were supplying non-lethal aid to the rebels, although in actual fact most investigative journalists had concluded there was more than non-lethal aid going to them. Most of the finance is coming from our ally in Saudi Arabia, who provides all the jobs up in Filton, for example, and the track record, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, for example, have been working with MI6 for decades to overthrow Gaddafi. So the idea that these people have just suddenly arrived from nowhere and now they're so dangerous that we've got to do something right now, this minute, is pretty laughable when you think about their relations with Western intelligence services and special forces, which were ongoing until quite recently.
OK, also, ISIS has been talked about as a multinational corporation because actually it's got big bank accounts. Why don't we just freeze their assets?
Well, this whole thing about funding is really important, isn't it? Where is the money coming from for ISIS? Well, it's basically coming from the Gulf states. I mean, we broke the story a few weeks ago on this programme about a meeting between ISIS and Boko Haram and Al-Qaeda or Al-Shabaab in Syria in order to coordinate their activities. And that's been picked up by the media in Nigeria and also by Tony Blair.
And where did this meeting take place?
Well, it took place in Mecca during the Hajj. Now, I don't know whether this meeting took place or not, but I got inside information that it did take place. But if it did take place in Saudi Arabia, and there is a coordination between these different groups, Saudi Arabia is our ally. Their chaps are trained at Sandhurst. They definitely are. So the idea, surely if we're going to try and stop this, the thing to do is to say to the Saudis to stop funding it, or better still, overthrow the Saudi monarchy and stick a bayonet up their backside like we did with Gaddafi. Because we believe in stuff like that, don't we? We believe in military force to get rid of evil dictators, whether it's Gaddafi or King Fahd, especially if they're terrorists. One
simple solution would be to stop buying ISIS oil, maybe.
Well, the ISIS oil is a red herring because a lot of the oil money that's going into it, into ISIS, is coming from Qatar and from Saudi Arabia. There's a deliberate attempt by the Western media to suggest that ISIS is funding itself through its own activities. Now, I'm sure they have got funding through their own activities. They're smuggling lots of petrol over the border into Turkey, for example. But until very, very recently, that border was open to all of these terrorists from all over the Middle East. They were being trained by MEET, the Turkish Secret Service and British and US Special Forces were involved in all of this. The chemical weapons attack in Ghouta this time last year, that chemical weapons came from Libya, from the stockpiles in Libya, and it must have been through the hands of probably US and British special forces before it ended up in the hands of the rebels who used it. And that's another factor which has been completely ignored in all of this, that the evidence is now piled up overwhelmingly. The Seymour Hersh, the US Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, has exposed all of this, that it was the rebels that were using sarin from Libya, and that must have been coordinated with Western intelligence services.
OK, what about Republican presidential candidate John McCain? Because he was meeting with the chief of ISIS, wasn't he?
This guy,
there are photographs all over the internet of him, and also their media chief. Obviously, they're running a very sophisticated media operation, ISIS, with these videos and this kind of thing. Their chief trained in the United States, and many of the leaders are actually from US prison camps like Guantanamo Bay.
Yes, and very few of them are actually Syrian. So, in other words, this is Al-Qaeda Redux, the creation of an international Islamic brigade to fight against the geopolitical enemies of the West. And if we'd gone to war with Syria this time last year and overthrown Assad, these are the people we would have brought to power, and that was the plan of the CIA and MI6.
So why has the Iraqi army collapsed in the front of ISIS? They didn't seem to really want to fight them, as Sir Edward Lee was saying from the debate today in the Commons.
Well, I've got my own views about this. I mean, basically the leadership of the Iraqi army fled and left their soldiers without any leadership, and then they threw down their weaponry.
Why did they flee?
Because probably they are working with the Americans as well. In other words, ISIS has been allowed to develop so that we can intervene, so that we can keep off. And basically, what we're talking about here is gas pipelines. There's a planned gas pipeline from Iran through Syria to the Mediterranean, which they don't want to happen. It's called the Islamic. The nickname is the Islamic Pipeline. They don't want that to happen. As an alternative plan for a pipeline running from Qatar through Syria to Turkey and out via possibly through Israel. But that requires regime change in Damascus, which is what's underpinning all of this. That's what this is all about.
It's another attempt to topple Assad. But anyway, the most important aspect of this, surely, is international law. The United Nations, they've not got. The Americans have been bombing Syria with no UN resolution. Surely that's just simply illegal.
It is illegal, and therefore everybody involved in it is breaking the law.
And what happens when you start to bypass the Security Council like that?
Well, I mean, you could say, well, it doesn't matter because everybody's doing it, and basically we bombed Kosovo without UN authorization. There's lots of things that the US basically all the time breaks international law. But you'll see that the debate in Britain is where the legal advice was, if you go into Syria, then you are breaking the law. The Russians and the Iranians have said that these attacks inside Syria break international law. The Syrians have said nothing. What they've indicated is that they were given indications of what was going to be targeted, but they haven't said that they're in favour of it or they're against it. But of course what could easily happen here is mission creep, where the RAF ends up bombing the Syrian army, and at that point the Syrian army will try and shoot them down, and if they do try and shoot them down, I hope they succeed.
Well, you mentioned the Syrians, and the Syrians do have an ambassador at the United Nations. Bashar al Jafari, and here he is, because I haven't heard very much from the Syrians. I thought I'd see if I could find some English language from the Syrian government and see what they make of all this. So we'll hear from Syrian ambassador to the UN, Bashar al Jafari, and then see what Martin's got to make of that.
We firmly pursue this war that we've pursued for a number of years against terrorism in all its forms, and we support any effort, international effort, any sincere international effort to combat terrorism in all its forms, and it's all in all its names. But this must be done while respecting the lives of innocent civilians, while respecting national sovereignty, and in step with international law. We affirm here that the participation of Israel in the coalition against ISIL undermines the credibility of the coalition. The fact that Israel shot down a Syrian plane that was only doing its national duty in bombing ISIS sites, al-Nusra sites, these groups which attacked humanitarians, that attacked members of the humanitarian mission, those acts show that there's an alliance between Israel and terrorist organizations, including the dependent Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups.
So So that was a chap called Bashar al-Jafari, and he's the Syrian ambassador to the United Nations. What do you make of what he said, Martin? Because he also there mentioned this shooting down of a Syrian jet by the Israelis this week.
Yeah, well, the Israelis claimed it was overflying Israeli territory, although when the guy ejected, he ended up on Syrian soil, so that doesn't seem likely.
But there is disputed territory, the Golan Heights particularly.
Well, the Golan Heights is supposedly part of Syria, according to international law, but the UN forces have been driven out of the Golan Heights by the rebels, and therefore the Israelis, if they want to, can invade Syria from the Golan Heights.
Now, the Israelis,
and this may, of course...
To be fair, the Israelis have said the jet was acting aggressively.
Well, it was flying over Syria. It wasn't... I mean, I think that's what the Syrians have maintained, that it was flying over Syria. It wasn't in any way a threat to the Israelis.
Well, let's have a look at the ideology of ISIS for a minute, because many of these fighters and those leading them have been taught in these Wahhabi, Saudi-funded schools of radical Islam around the world.
Well, yes, and if we were serious about dealing with Wahhabi terrorism, then we'd go to the root of it in Saudi Arabia. But, of course, Prince Bandar of Saudi Arabia was a very close friend of George Bush Jr., and, as I say, all their chaps are trained at Sandhurst. So it ought to be quite simple for us to put an end to this, but we don't. I mean, we've demanded that Assad steps down right now. Not in 10 years' time, not in 5 years' time, not in 5 weeks' time, right now. But, of course, we've got the Saudis, we've got to understand there will be a democracy in Saudi Arabia one day.
So are we or are we not working? Are we or are we not working with the Saudi government, with Bashar al-Assad?
Well, various people were suggesting, including Malcolm Rifkin, that if we were serious about this, we had to talk to the Iranians and the Syrians. And, of course, we've not done that. The Americans have passed a law saying that they're going to support this airstrike on Syria, but they're also going to remove Assad. That just shows that they're not serious about tackling ISIS.
I suppose.
And in actual fact, as I say, there is overwhelming evidence that British and US special forces were training these militants in Turkey and in Jordan less than a year ago.
I suppose there are quite a lot of...
The first thing you should do is go and find those people and say, what were you up to? Who told you to do that? And it'll lead back to MI6 and quite possibly to the cabinet.
And many of these Middle Eastern leaders
knows about it. Let's find out.
Many of these Middle Eastern leaders are very, very nervous about trusting the United States. Think about, for example, Saddam Hussein, who was very friendly with the Americans just before. In fact, they told him, didn't they? It's okay, you can go and invade Kuwait. And then they attacked him. So many of them are very nervous and they don't really trust the Americans. Also, the way that this has been presented I found really worrying because, for example, on Newsnight, the BBC coverage of it, in the run-up to this Commons debate, what we've had is just a selection of various people who all seem to think that this is a good idea. They're presenting the idea that actually all the various factions think it's good to bomb ISIS in Israel. I mean, in Iraq.
Well, what you've got is people being bamboozled. There's supposedly been several beheadings of Western journalists, although people who are experts, doctors and video specialists, have looked at these videos and said, well, actually, whatever's going on there, it's not a beheading. And, of course, all of these people have, in fact, got military intelligence backgrounds. That's just a fact. Now, they may be journalists or they may not, but they do, in fact, have military intelligence backgrounds. Now, the fact is that ISIS has killed 70,000 Syrian soldiers, up to 100,000 civilians, and there's masses of videos on the internet of them people really beheading people, Syrian soldiers and ordinary Christians and what have you. So the evidence about their bad behaviour is overwhelming, and it was overwhelming this time last year when we were told that we had to go and fight the Syrian army so that they could win the civil war. Now, of course, we're being told, as the Tory MP Lee said earlier, to stand on our heads, and now these are the worst people ever. They behead people. Gosh, there were more people beheaded in Saudi Arabia in August, including somebody for sorcery. But are we going to invade Saudi Arabia as a result of that? No, we're not, because, of course, they're brown people. And therefore, why we're getting all excited about this is because white people have been beheaded, supposedly. It's racist, it's wrong, and, of course, the real killer is that these groups have intimate relations with Western intelligence services.
Now Muslims in Britain have issued a fatwa against ISIS, and they've called for the press not to call them Islamic anything.
Well, indeed, what they're doing is creating an evil image of Islam, which can then be used to whip up the population for further wars and so on. It's quite clear what happened in Libya, and it's quite clear what's been happening in Syria. The most extreme jihadis were armed, trained, and supported by us. The RAF were acting as their air force during the campaign against Gaddafi. And if we'd gone into war this time last year, the RAF would have been acting as the air force for ISIS. That's the reality reality. But now we're being told, oh, no, forget all of that. And, of course, what they're relying on is that people are basically slow, stupid, they don't pay attention, and, they're easily bamboozled by what are essentially propagandistic methods.
OK, so why is it OK to go and join the Israeli Defence Force and commit genocide against the Palestinians, but not to go and join ISIS?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that that MI5 and MI6 were encouraging people to go out and fight with ISIS, and then, of course, what happens is you'd be a damn fool if you did, because, of course, they then say, oh, look at these terrible people, they've joined ISIS. Like Haruna Swat, who was named as the mastermind of the 7/7 bombings by the Metropolitan Police, and then the Americans piped up and said, actually, he's an MI6 double agent. These groups have always been heavily penetrated and influenced by Western intelligence services and by the Saudi Arabian Mukhabarat. The fact is that these people are our creation virtually 100%. And if we wanted to stop it, we could stop it tomorrow, and not by dropping bombs on empty desert.
Now, you just mentioned the 7/7 London bombings, because apparently people who are conspiracy theorists about that are actually fueling terrorism.
Well, I saw that David Cameron going on about conspiracy theories earlier today. You know why he's coming out with that? It's because it's absolutely on the record, there's no doubt about it, that British special forces were training ISIS less than a year ago. That's not a conspiracy theory, that's just a fact. And of course that's why it's so embarrassing, and why he's got to say it's a conspiracy theory. If you say such things, it's actually pretty straightforward. OK, well, let's have a listen now to David Cameron speaking at the United Nations on that topic.
The root cause of this terrorist threat is a poisonous ideology of Islamist extremism. This is nothing to do with Islam, which is a peaceful religion which inspires countless acts of generosity every day. Islamist extremism, on the other hand, believes in using the most brutal forms of terrorism to force people to accept a warped worldview and to live in a quasi-medieval state. To defeat ISIL and organizations like it, we must defeat this ideology in all its forms. As evidence emerges about the backgrounds of those convicted of terrorist offences, it is clear that many of them were initially influenced by preachers who claim not to encourage violence, but whose worldview can be used as a justification for it. We know this worldview, the peddling of lies, that 9/11 was somehow a Jewish plot, or that the 7/7 London attacks were staged. The idea that Muslims are persecuted all over the world as a deliberate act of Western policy. The concept of an inevitable clash of civilizations. We must be clear. To defeat the ideology of extremism, we need to deal with all forms of extremism, not just violent extremism. For governments, there are some obvious ways we can do this. We must ban preachers of hate from coming to our countries. We must prescribe organizations that incite terrorism against people at home and abroad. We must work together to take down illegal online material like the recent videos of ISIL murdering hostages. And we must stop the so-called non-violent extremists from inciting hatred and intolerance in our schools, our universities, and yes, even our prisons. Of course, some will argue that this is not compatible with free speech and intellectual inquiry. But I ask you, would we sit back and allow right-wing extremists, Nazis or Ku Klux Klansmen to recruit on our university campuses? No. So we shouldn't stand by and just allow any form of non-violent extremism. We need to argue that prophecies of a global war of religion, pitting Muslims against the rest of the world, these things are nonsense. We need Muslims and their governments around the world to reclaim their religion from these sick terrorists, as so many are doing and quite rightly doing today. We all need help, and to help them with programs that channel young people away from these poisonous ideologues. And we need the strongest possible international focus on tackling this ideology, which is why here at the United Nations, the United Kingdom is calling for a new special representative on extremism.
Well, from some of the things you say, Martin, I would think maybe you're the sort of extremist that David Cameron is particularly worried about. I mean, are you one of these people that thinks 9/11 was a Jewish plot?
not a Jewish plot. It was an inside job with Mossad involved, according to, for example, General Ivashov, who was the commander of the Russian armed forces on 9/11. And of course, he doesn't just get his information from the Daily Mail. There is other people. Mahathir Mohamad, the president of Malaysia, he's quite clear that there was something untoward.
And 7/7, Martin, was that staged?
Well, but as you know, Tony, we both made a film about it with Adrian Connick, which called Mind the Gap, which definitely and former MI5 officers, which certainly raised that question. The fact is that Western intelligence services from the 1980s in Operation Cyclone have been recruiting jihadis, first to fight the Russians and then to fight all sorts of other people. People in MI6 know exactly what's been going on, and I'm sure David Cameron knows exactly what's been going on, because he was briefed this time last year, 18 months ago, about what British Special Forces were doing in Jordan and in Turkey. And I'm sure that if we wanted to find out what was happening, we just called these people and said, well, which of these jihadis have you been training? Because in actual fact, there's overwhelming evidence that that's what's been going on.
So do you think that they should have the Nazis and the Ku Klux Klan in our universities and schools?
I think the problem with any extreme views, well, of any kind, is what do you do about those extreme views? I think people are entitled to freedom of speech, but there are certain things that can't be tolerated. For example, threatening other people and so on and so forth. But I think people raising questions about things like 9/11, where 3 buildings collapsed, not 2, 3, WTC 7 collapsed. There's been a whole big billboard about this in the centre of New York, showing that for the last week and a half, put up there by architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, who have over 2,000 architects and engineers in the US questioning the official story. And that's because Western intelligence services and the Gladio networks, which have been operating in Western Europe since the 1940s, have a track record, 100% track record of engaging in provocational terrorism.
Okay, well,
that's not conspiracy theory, that's historical fact.
Well, let's get back to this week, and what with there was an attack by the Americans earlier this week in Syria. Only trouble was that several civilians and children were killed as well, and also with this Syrian jet being shot down, it does look like actually the US and Israel are at war with Syria.
Well, what also happened is that they bombed loads of empty buildings because the ISIS terrorists had been given a tip-off that was what was going to happen, and had disappeared. And also so civilians were left.
They were also bombing some of the more moderate factions, not ISIS.
Well, the point is that the moderate factions don't really exist. I mean, there are over 100 different groups fighting in Syria. We have encouraged that. Roland Dumas, the former French foreign minister, has been on French TV about 2 years ago, and he said that he was approached at an international meeting when he was a foreign minister before the Arab Spring by British officials, not US officials, British officials, said, we are going to run an armed uprising in Syria. Do you want to join in? Now, in other words, it may be that Britain started the war in Syria, in which case all the bloodshed is on the hands of our politicians. What should we do about that if it turns out that we started the war in Syria?
Okay, well,
what should happen to those
finally, you pointed towards the evidence that there's a military psyop going on here with these beheading videos being issued by this woman called Rita Katz, who's based in Bethesda in Washington, D.C., just 20 minutes drive away from CIA headquarters, and her organisation, which is called SITE. I don't know if you know what it stands for.
Search Internet for Terrorist Entities.
Search for International Terrorist Entities, I think it's called, but it's in Washington. That's where these videos came from. So I thought I'd track her down, and I found quite an interesting interview with CNN. Tried to interview her, and they did interview her about where she found these videos, because they didn't come from the Middle East, they came from Washington.
How did your organization obtain the video?
Hi, we at SITE have been researching the jihadi threat online for over a decade, follow their steps, monitor their activities, and study their activities online. Anytime Al-Qaeda or ISIS become more and more sophisticated and adopt new technology, we follow that technology and we study their techniques. By doing that, we can predict where they might be uploading the videos online. After all, these videos are being disseminated online, they are published online, and so they have to go somewhere online for the dissemination. We looked and found.
So you looked and you found it. Obviously, you just heard the State Department spokeswoman, tell me, look, they haven't yet authenticated the video. Are you certain it is what it claims to be?
The video shows the beheading of Stephen Sutcliffe. The location where the video was obtained from is the location that ISIS usually uploads their original videos to. The video shows a clear message from ISIS that follows the same message that it had before. And in fact, within a short time after our release, ISIS account on social media indicated that within a short time they will be releasing the video, only we actually had that video beforehand and were able to beat them with the release.
Does that sound at all credible to our listeners? ISIS didn't put the videos up online. They were going to put them up online, but this woman, Rita Katz, who's got many connections with Mossad, based in Washington, she got hold of it first, and she did the publicity for ISIS. Although now, of course, we can't see the videos because they're too horrific and we're not allowed to look at them. Although the Times, Murdoch's Times, did an analysis of the videos 2 weeks ago that said, well, whatever these videos show, it's not a beheading because there's not a drop of blood in any of them. We are being fed propaganda by a war machine, and we're going to war. But of course, war is a much bigger thing than going shopping or playing football.
Getting bigger by being better. The #1 choice for Bristol. This is BCFM 93.2.